Just wanted to talk about a few things this evening. I had prepared a lecture in one direction and then rerouted a little bit just because there's so much interesting discourse around the subject of photography books today that even just refreshing my memory on what has gone online recently, some projects that were launched, as well as just reading some very, very recent pieces that I wanted to talk about, reminded me that there's a lot of other stuff to talk about. So originally, if you read a description about tonight that was going to get into nuts and bolts about proposing books and everything, I'm really not going to get into that, and I hope that that's okay. But there are many. Yeah, there are many other resources for that as well, some of which I will mention. So this is a very fluxy time for photography, and I hope that the overall assembly of these ideas in the lectures so far, and really honored to follow Eleanor and Ruben tonight. I really hope that all of these lectures accrue to reveal kind of the vague outlines of what seems to be a really very, very fast-moving, quickly morphing practice. And the rest, of course, once you get the vague outlines, will be filled in by all of the practitioners in the room. So by way of introduction, I want to say that most of my professional career has been spent working with books in one way or another. And that goes back to clerking at several B. Dalton booksellers in high school and various Phoenix metropolitan shopping malls. And I'm pretty sure that B. Dalton's doesn't even exist anymore. At university in Los Angeles, I somewhat naively applied for a job at my favorite bookstore in Santa Monica, which is Hennessy and Ingalls, an art, architecture, and design bookstore. And though I was an English major, I think that experience really turned me around, and I felt like that experience was very much a secondary education. I got sucked into the world of visual books, and that completely influences what I do and how I do today. So I moved to San Francisco after college with the idea that I wanted to work in art book publishing or teaching. I didn't really know much about either. But I knew, in a sense, more about publishing as a bookseller. And there was pretty much one trade publisher in San Francisco at the time that I pursued, and that was Chronicle Books. At the time, Chronicle was actually the distributor for Phaidon when Phaidon was first beginning to make its first inroads into US distribution. And I hope the publishing talk isn't too arcane, but it seems relevant since everything that I'm going to talk about in terms of my history is almost what we're going to talk about what's succeeding it today. So I spent the next 15 years at Chronicle, 10 of those as an editor. And when I started, Chronicle was, as it is now, really well known for other categories than art and photography. It was known for cookbooks and pop culture and humor and lifestyle. But it had a few editors who managed a small but really rather respectable art and photography list. So, oh, sorry, I was supposed to do that earlier. That's me. That's just my site. But I'm going to go back in time rather than what I'm doing now into just some photography book publishing history from the 90s. Way back then. Way back in 1996, Andrea Monica published her first book with Chronicle. And so this was an example of work that was really rather respectable and challenging in a way, difficult for Chronicle to sell because it wasn't a dedicated art and photography publisher. In other words, the same salespeople who were selling the art and photography list were also selling the cookbooks, the humor books, and it made for a somewhat disjointed seeming list, though the editors who were there managing this category were doing a really, really great job. Paperback reissue of American Prospects by Joel Sternfeld. Sally Gall's The Water's Edge. And as well as Keith Carter books. I mean, there was a lot going on at the time, serious photography publishing. Once those editors left, the list started to atrophy a bit, and I moved in, again, somewhat naively, as a rather junior editor managing this entire list, and that was a shock to me because I thought I had landed the most sort of, amazing, most prestigious gig in all of, in the entire publishing house. And in one sense, I had, but I was also into, to hit the learning curve rather steeply. What I soon learned is that I was about to tackle arguably the most challenging category in trade publishing. And the reasons why I tend to interact with each other and to compound and magnify each other's effects. So these books tend to be larger and therefore more expensive on the retail price point. They're very demanding in terms of the production and design care that goes into them, so they really need skilled teams. And the audience is simply smaller. The idea that art and photo books will sell their runs to stylish people who just want nice things for their coffee tables is pretty much a myth. I mean, that's a very small segment of book buyers, and those of us who are book buyers, we're the minority, for this category. But I started to build up the list again, which took time, but opened up a lot of new directions for Chronicle. We published this PBS tie-in book in 2000 about the history of 20th century photography with a lot of really, really serious scholarship from Vicki Goldberg. And I also acquired Eleanor Carucci's first book, and was very proud that Closer, unlike a lot of other photo books at Chronicle and elsewhere, sold through its entire first printing and went on for a revised edition in 2009. And in a way, Eleanor and I were really both starting out in our careers when we started working together, and I'm still very honored to this day that she trusted me with this process, which is very fraught, but I think turned out well. And I think I always thought of this book as this will always be Eleanor's first book, and I really thought it was important for us to take a risk on an emerging photographer like this, because there will always, and just knowing, sensing, intuiting where she would go in her career, there was always just going to be this amazing first body of work that needed to have a life. So at the same time, I was really interested in the topic of photography books as an independent medium, and started writing photo book reviews for PhotoWise print magazine when Darius Himes was the editor. And along with this writing over the next few years, I did as many photo books as I could, from more commercial-minded crossover books like this one about vintage computers, which definitely had an interesting sub-market that I was not aware of earlier, to kind of more challenging ones like Jonah Frank's Write Portraits of the Evangelical Ivy League. Linda Connor hadn't had a big trade edition monograph ever, surprisingly, and really honored to work with her on that. And David Mazel's Library of Dust. But it was a huge amount of work, and it was incredibly rewarding, and even as I was frustrated by the way these books would or wouldn't perform in the market, I still really dug in for as long as I could. But in 2008, I took a hiatus from publishing, and I moved to New York, and I got an MFA 2 floors down in the design criticism program. So I rerouted a bit, but during that time, I was still working on books independently, and I was getting a lot of solicitations for consultation as well. And It's true. When I counted it up afterwards, I counted 100 books that I had worked on. So I was also like a little, I think I was maybe a little fragile, a little burnt out at that point. So I wanted to recount the history of my trade publishing career, not to like, not in a self-aggrandizing way, I hope, because I don't think my experience was, in a sense, that special. In a sense, it was very typical of my generation of editors and book people. And the timing of my departure as an in-house editor was fortuitous in some ways, because after I left Chronicle, many other publishers cut back severely, and well, including Chronicle, that is, and the art and photo list was amongst the hardest hit there. So I don't think I could necessarily do the same job that I was doing if I were still there. And of course, a few other factors were coming into play at the time. So when I got out of school, I started my own thing, which was just to formalize basically what I had been doing throughout my MFA, which was working on books. And so I've been going to reviews still and finding that there are a lot of interesting trends in publishing that people are talking about, they want to know about, and that they're doing on their own. So just to review a few projects that I have worked on in the last few years. The first projects that I've worked on independently are just coming to market basically this year and next, including Susan Bernstein's book, Scott Passfield's Gay in America, which is just about to have its launch, and Julia Solis, a photographer who takes pictures of abandoned theaters all around the world, and that's going to a New York house called Mark Batty Publisher. So one of the things that really started emerging around the time, that even though it's been around since I think 2006, if I'm not mistaken, is Blurb, of course. And I'll come back to Blurb a little bit later, and you all know Blurb, I'm sure. I think one of the biggest questions that I get is, should I publish with Blurb? And the question is so very freighted because it gets into this like almost like hugely philosophical, existential publishing question, which is still outstanding. It's still an unanswered kind of open question, which is Blurb publishing? Is Blurb publishing in the sense that it creates a market where people go to get their photo books? So we can open up that question a little bit later, actually. I'm not sure I have the answer. And also about this time, the discourse about photo books was really overflowing. Like I thought I and a few other people were just sort of photo book geeks, but then it really became this thing. Numerous blog posts, entire networks like, including my old colleague Darius Himes, who has just published this with Princeton Architectural Press. Really great book. It is a very nuts and bolts look at the process of publishing and applying your work to book form. So something I would recommend. It's almost like I should just sell this book on my site as my consultancy and just kind of like take care of a lot of front end business that way. But in terms of the discourse around photography books, I mean, there were entire networks launched, like Andy Adams' FLAC Photo Books group on Facebook. Also a very, very good resource. I would recommend it just because anyone, as a group, anyone can post and promote their projects, but it's also, so it's a great way to learn about other projects and the ways, the models that people are using in order to do this. But it's also just for general knowledge and research, it's a very good tool. In 2009, Andy and Mickey Johnson put together a really ambitious project whereby they asked dozens of photography bloggers to write about the future of the photo book. And the response was really overwhelming. It was just a screen grab from, that's not the whole thing. That's not all of the contributions to this sort of group-sourced blog project. But really overwhelming response, and I also recommend looking through the index of this on Mickey's Resolve blog site. And I'm sorry I don't have URLs up. If anyone needs to, if they want to take, if you need follow-up on this, I'm happy to provide some URLs later. And so just picking through a few of these is an interesting exercise to learn about the kind of, what people are concerned about, what the prognostications are. This was already about 2 years ago. I think it's a major example of how knowledge can be solicited, generated, and archived with smart digital tools. But after all this, we're still left to ask, so where are photo books today? And it's a topic that still gets endless attention amongst photographers, editors, and publishers. And to such a degree that one could mistakenly think that, books aren't happening, just discourse around books. But they're really, that they're just being talked about. But there is a lot going on. And the truth is that even with the ostensible competition of all this online media, and the huge hit that the mainstream publishing industry has taken, there's a huge amount of publishing happening. It's just not necessarily happening at the trade houses like the one that I used to work at. So if anything, my model of being like a publishing consultant is a little rear guard. I mean, I'm helping people try to get their work into shape to present to traditional publishers in a sense. And it's still happening, it's there. This is still, it's still active, it's real. But what's growing up around it is a lot of independent stuff that is, not beholden to the traditional model anymore. So those projects are really way more efficient and innovative in a sense than trade publishing has been out of necessity. In my contribution, The Future of Photo Books blog source project, I wrote a piece called Inversely Proportional, where I tried to take the measure of what I observed going on and risked a few predictions as well. Again, this is almost 2 years ago, and this blog that Jaime kindly mentioned also is pretty much dormant. So it's kind of an archive of just writing that I was doing at the time. Feel free. You'll be the only visitors there lately. But I thought that this piece I really dumped a lot of thought into. So I wanted to revisit some of what I was talking about then, and want to compare if maybe some of these things might be relevant, what may have come true, and what still seems outstanding. So, allow me to freestyle a little bit about this now, because I wanted to pick up a few threads from this, and I'm going to call out a few items that I think were relevant from the post. One is that I wrote, it's not primarily production quality, which will continue to improve, that holds the key to how photo books evolve away from traditional publishing models. I think it's distribution in its meaning now and improbable future implications, which is the main consideration. By extension, distribution will be the key to how all books evolve in the future. I don't know if this prediction can be verified yet or not. Probably not. But one thing that emerged as of last year was something really interesting that makes me think about different models of distribution. One thing that people are concerned about is, in a sense, the glut of independent publishing that's going on right now. Because the tools are so handy, so available, and relatively affordable, although that's scaled in different ways. Distribution can be making your Blurb book available on the Blurb marketplace. That's certainly, that's a kind of passive model of people coming to it. Although what you do with those copies to promote it is, in a sense, the role that the publisher used to have. You're now the entrepreneur, you're the publisher, you're the salesperson, you're the marketer. this project, which Larissa LeClaire started, the Indie Photo Book Library, is both a repository and a showcase of books that are independently produced. So if you send your project to Larissa, it is in the permanent collection. This includes exhibition catalogs, print on demand, artist books, zines, projects that are printed on newsprint, of which we've seen a number of recently, limited editions, and non-English language photography books. And they are housed permanently, and they also go on the road with Larissa once in a while. And I think Larissa's contribution is really amazing in terms of just expanding this idea of what distribution can be. Just having, I mean, these aren't books that you buy from her, but this solves an aspect of the kind of supply, the oversupply problem to independent photo books today. I also wrote, there's a wide assumption that distribution is all about how the consumer will find books in the future, but that's only one half of it. The other half is obviously how will the author-photographer find projects worth publishing, balance the effort that it takes to make a good book under any model versus the number of consumers ready for it on the other end. The answer would suggest a certain leveling. The emerging photographer can go on his or her own way and create a fairly well-printed book with an unremarkable design and publish it to the tune of a few dozen contacts and fans from the MFA program and Flickr friends. I'm sorry, that was pretty dismissive. But I was trying to just set up a point. And this was an issue that was brought up recently on a panel that I was part of in June. In Boston, the Magenta Foundation Flash Forward Festival. I was on the panel with a few independent publishers who are doing really amazing work, and I want to just briefly show you some of that. So Michael Itkoff, Daylight Magazine, Shane Lavalette of Lay Flat, Bruno Caskel of Self-Publish Be Happy. Again, these are outfits that are each very meritorious, worth looking into. Bruno's latest edition from Self-Publish Be Happy was just launched at Dashwood last night, and it was Self-Publish Be Naughty, and it's kind of a lo-fi pornography book. It was really marvelous. And of course, Andy Adams and Mickey Johnson, who had started that blog crowd post project earlier. So each of the presenters there had their own amazing projects that they were talking about. And my contribution to this was to tell the story of a small startup publisher called Candela Books. And Candela is a Virginia-based photographer named Gordon Stetness. And Gordon met, at one of his own openings in New York, met a 90-year-old photographer named Gita Lenz and befriended her and found out that she had this amazing body of work behind her. She had work in the Family of Man exhibition, and she had done street photography, she had done formalist abstract photography, and other than if you knew every name in the Family of Man catalog, you would not have otherwise heard of her because, like a lot of people, she found it too hard to hack as a professional photographer and change careers, but a lot of amazing unseen work. So Gordon endeavored to start an entire publisher to preserve Gita's legacy. And I personally thought this was very impressive because, it wasn't altruistic. He had to, in one sense, he had to form an entire business model around this and build a business up from scratch. But he wasn't doing it about his work. And so I was really rather impressed with that. And Gordon's second book is Shelby Lee Adams' next book. And so he's, just by starting this legacy project, he's contributing, I think, in a meaningful way to contemporary photography publishing. Just a few spreads from the book. So that quote about self-publishing was, I think, something to keep in mind, because a lot of the photographers who I know who are publishers are, sometimes the publishing endeavors are ways to launch their work into book form, and sometimes it's a combination. Both, Michael Itkoff and Shane Lavalette, they're photographers, and their publishing endeavors are not all their work. They are combinations, they're collaborative projects, and this idea of collaboration and the ensemble, I think, is a really strong part of what's going on in publishing right now. And I also just like this quote from Gordon as well. So without being flippant about it, one sideways answer to my question about how photographers will find good content to publish is to be a photographer and not publish your own content. But that, and again, I say that not derisively, because I really think that when you open up what the collaborative possibilities are in this realm, there are many more opportunities. So it gets back to this question, which is a very, very recent question. This is from, I don't know if you know Jorg Kohlberg's Conscientious blog, but still seems to be a pretty valuable, a very opinionated resource. And Jorg wrote this post yesterday in response to Rob Haggart of Photo Editor's post, which was called "Why Does Everyone Think They Need a Photo Book?" And it's a compelling bit. I just wanted to put this up. This distinction between needing a photo book and wanting a photo book, which gets to one of the heart of the matter, in a sense. It's something that when I work with a new client, there's always this kind of exploration phase of, what is this going to do for you? Is this your calling card? Is this actually a tool to get the exhibitions? Which is kind of what he's alluding to, what Jorg is alluding to in this question as well. And it's something that I think every photographer needs to answer for his or her own sake before, in a sense, presenting it to the public, because it should be very clear that the answer is not based on the market really anymore, because even in the traditional mainstream publishing model, making money back wasn't necessarily an option. The model wasn't based on that. But this reminded me of, this led to something else that I wanted to mention, and getting back into the ensemble, the collaborative mode of it. And that goes back to one of my original posts from the Crowd blog project. I wrote, another point to emphasize is that a huge drawback in the print-on-demand model is the lack of collaboration. Sure, never leave your workstation and you're still a blogger, you're still a music producer, you're a filmmaker, you're also a book publisher, the romance of the solitary genius. What's lost here? The combination of differently specialized people bringing their expertise to bear on a project in the making. I assert that most books are multi-authored from concept to object. Several people, individually but interdependently, control the creative variables of the book. The team that creates a book includes, but is not limited to, the author, editor, designer, and production person, as well as the manufacturers. Those Chinese guys that get slagged so much, they provide the majority of the color printing nowadays, and they're pretty brilliant at it. The point is that with mass manufactured objects, which is what books are, sole authorship doesn't exist. Contemplating the book as a product of an inspired photographer-editor partnership ignores the process of how the book was created in materiality. Though I will say, again, revealing undeniable bias, the role of the editor is largely invisible and often unacknowledged. So all that to just point to the importance of this kind of ensemble model, the collaboration. One thing that I think photographers don't appreciate enough is the value of design in their book. You might agree. And I think that one of the ways that good book projects start is with a good design partnership, frankly. And I really encourage all photographers and emerging photographers to partner with designers early, because I think that the results are very eye-opening. Even if it's someone else to help edit in sequence, which is always a very personal, very subjective thing. But I think designers are really trained to, in different ways than photographers are, to pay attention to these issues of rhythm and pacing, and just the kind of unconscious effects that design can make to make a book project really, really complete, really amazing. So, and a lot of people ask, but then I have to pay a designer, and yet I think that we're already in a kind of like, we're like returning to a kind of like tradesperson, like medieval guild sort of barter society anyway for so many things that I can't imagine that we can't trade services in this way too. And I think that it's easier to publish as a group project than sort of solo. You learn, if you're about to start self-publishing, that you are enlisting of a lot of other people anyway. You're already doing that. And so what I liked about Michael Littkoff's Daylight and Bruno Cascal's Self-Publish Be Happy is that they're really collaborations. They're ensemble works. And so that was pretty much where I ended up. I had other prognostications to make, and I think that they're just too dense, and sort of it would be better to open it up to discuss at this point. And I'm happy to take questions. And thank you for being here. You could have been at Bill Hunt and Susan Bright tonight, and that would have been cool. But I really appreciate you being here. So thank you very much. I'm not sure I could tell you what would be the most active ones. You could break it down into, again, there are a lot of other, there's a huge gulf between like the traditional mainstream large trade house publishers and the independent scene. There's a lot of small publishers very active here in the UK and Europe that I think are doing wonderful work. And so, for example, you look at a few UK houses like Trolley or Dowie Lewis. Dowie is spelled D-E-W-I. It's always a tricky one. And here in Brooklyn, Umbridge Editions, and those would be much more, I'd say, documentary and photojournalistic. Excellent houses, but it's good to know the scope of a publisher's, these subcategories, what they do and don't do before approaching them, of course. So this question becomes relevant for that. You'll find it, I would say, arguably most challenging to find anyone who does, what is fine art? Fine art is such a vague category in a way. Anything sort of abstract or still life oriented would almost necessarily have to be accompanied by it would be in the context of an exhibition catalog, I think, in a lot of cases. That work doesn't, in a sense, get published in a sort of freestanding way. If you're Irving Penn, after a long career, you can get that work published. But I think that's very challenging for a lot of photographers today. But then that's why, context is everything in this sense, but that's also why Blurb really does have a role, I think, in this discussion, is that whatever the work is, if you go through the process, that book will exist in the marketplace. That will exist in your hands. You can use that for your various means. But the category question is a tricky one. I mean, you see, one thing that I tell photographers a lot when they're preparing their work for proposals is just to do the research, easy market research on PhotoEye or on Amazon, and at good bookstores. If any bookstores near you, carry photography. We're not all so lucky to have like a Dashwood or a Hennessy and Ingalls in our backyard, but just to see what is being published. And it can be a little confusing, but you can gauge trends, I think, that way. When it comes to portraiture, I mean, celebrity portraits still have a market, weirdly, even though there seems to be so much of it. But it's accessible, to a crossover audience. That's accessible photography in a lot of ways, and not to constantly thump on this thing that I wrote 2 years ago, but I think I ended that post with that the most successful subcategory will still be cat and dog books, so like photography books on that level are always going to do awesome, but. For better or for worse, but anyway. I would say that in traditional trade publishing and fine art, and to an extent the fine art publishers as well, authors, photographers in this case, would receive an advance against royalties. And some authors that I dealt with when I was an editor, I was also in a sense like the negotiator. I was the one making the offer, and these offers were modest. I mean, they were always modest, unless they were a big deal, unless this book was going to be a big deal, something that would get a print run up to beyond 10,000 copies, which is major for a photography book, really. Then there would be negotiation around the advance, and I would always try to make the case that you, as the photographer, over the course of your career, have poured way more money into this project than could ever be like quantified by what you would get in an advance. I mean, you're forever in debt in one sense by being dedicated to your career, by being a serious photographer. You don't nickel and dime your own value as a photographer in a sense. You've been buying equipment, you've been buying education, and so, in one sense, that was just trying to be a savvy negotiator and not always succeeding. But I believe it really that the advance and the royalty rates were not as important as these other factors of like, do you trust, do we trust each other? Or do you trust what this publishing house offers you? Do you trust this production team that we're introducing you to? I mean, there were all these other bigger factors, I thought. So that was then, in a sense, and the now part is that these same publishers, if they're doing art and photography books, those advances have dropped further, or they were gone, and I think photographers are understandably a bit resentful about that. Like it looked tricky before, and now it just feels like you're just going to get screwed at any opportunity. Beyond that, there are the publishers who take your money, who their model, and these are some very good publishers and some not so good publishers, but what they have in common sometimes is that they'll take a subvention. Their model is not really, they couldn't afford to do what they do, I think, by paying out advances, and in a lot of cases by by any other means than taking the money that basically funds their production for your book. And that changes a lot of things. You are suddenly less of an author, almost more of a client, and you're getting a service in a sense, and the service is printing your book almost. It's still publishing your book, but it's almost like printing your book is the main thing. So in the last few years, all of that has changed really dramatically, I think, and that's what I think increasingly turns people to just go like, why aren't I just doing this myself? You know, in a sense, there are still conventional reasons to do it in that. In the course of photographers' careers, there's still an exhibition course that a lot of people take, and that course seems to run more or less parallel with, or it can run parallel, it often runs parallel with publishing course, and that's why when I, as an editor in-house at Chronicle, would look at a photographer and they're emerging, the work is really good, it's solid, they seem to be on a track. What are the other aspects that are going on in their career? What's going on commercially, if there's that aspect? What's going on exhibition-wise, representation? You know, these things need to converge often they benefit, you know, everything sort of cross-markets each other in that sense. So exhibitions, major retrospectives, mid-career or late retrospectives, those conventionally do come with publishing. They should come with publishing beyond just the sort of smaller catalog treatment. But beyond that, I think that question you ask is still very good. And I think that, you know, it's not just about photographers soul searching as to, you know, why do I really want this, but what I also encourage people to do, and why this idea of sort of like photography book literacy, or like photography book as an independent medium almost, as like its own sort of convergence of an art form and a, you know, and a mechanical tool, is that I think that people who do best with books start to get really deep into what the book uniquely does with their work and for their work. I mean, and I just don't want to get too metaphysical about it, but, you know, to think of a book space as its own sort of independent space, as if it were, how do you design an exhibition, or how do you design a presentation? The book space is really unique, and you can do things with it that you can't do anywhere else. And the photographers who, I think, get into that aspect of it and really start understanding the subtleties of that. And what's nice about this is, I think, like, it, you know, again, like, not to get like just, you know, use the force, but it's like you can trust yourself on this, and trusting yourself is like looking at the books that amaze you and just being with them and trying to understand why they work the way they work. Like, part of it is mechanical, part of it is harder to quantify, but, you know, being like a sensitive viewer, a sensitive reader, like, what is this doing to me and why? And start trying to, you know, apply those intuitions into how you would inhabit that book space with your own work. So I think people who get that serious about it, in a sense, without being, you know, freaked out by like the sort of, I don't know, the little, you know, book design intricacies and the difficulties that production knowledge implies. Like I think that those become very literate people when it comes to creating their own projects as books. So yeah, that may have gone a little sideways from where you were hoping, but I think that people who understand what a book can be in this independent sense are going to make really good books, basically. Not to underestimate those roles, but I almost think that the designer-photographer partnership is really good. And sometimes the photographer is the designer, and they're either trained or untrained, really good at that, and that is a kind of like, a multi-talented person can do a lot. The value of the writer is relative. When you're thinking of a book that you pick up in a bookstore, if you saw a photography book by someone you've never heard of, but your favorite novelist wrote something for it, I think that what we hoped in trade publishing is that would at least get some more people to it. And yet I don't know if it did. I don't know if the Alice Sebold essay got us any more sales for that photography book, because those audiences usually aren't kind of, when there was like physical browsing in the stores, they aren't in that part of the store. So I always thought of it as, and also like, I would get proposals of sort of poetry photography collaborations, and those almost never work. Like those are just, and that's hard to say without hurting people's feelings, but like those just don't work because they're both incredibly particular. And if you don't like one, you're just not gonna write it out, So I would say that when it comes to the role of the writer in this book, I think it's often appropriate. Some books are incredibly writing heavy, like a book that I'm working on with David Maisel right now is going to be a retrospective of his entire aerial work, all of the aerial work that he's done in his career from the 80s. And each one of those sections is going to have a different writer attached to it. And some of them are like art historians, some of them are photography people, some of them are architectural theorists. Like it's a really diverse group. And I think it doesn't make his work more interesting, but it's going to make a more interesting book, if that makes sense. And when thinking about those aspects of what goes into a book, I often just try to tell people to apply the litmus test of like, does it make the book the best book it can be? Sometimes, and check that against other people as well, because sometimes enough is enough, and too much, anything else is too much, really. Like, you don't need 12 essays in a book. You may need one or two. They can be literary interpretations. They can be more poetic responses to work. And again, like what we would often joke about is that we don't know if anyone reads these, but the piece has to be substantive on its own, and it has to add to the book and make the book in a sense better. So I would say just apply these litmus tests to it. Is it appropriate? Is it good in and of itself? If it brings a potential crossover set of eyes to it, then even better. I think that photographers need to understand its role in a sense, and it is publishing in a very real sense, but that doesn't. It's not publishing in the sense that Dashwood now carries your blurb book, or that Photo Eye carries your blurb book. It's its own marketplace that it has to kind of carve out an entire constituency, unto itself. I think there are people who use blurb rather avidly to to create projects and you know, it's fairly big name photographers as well. And I'm just trying to remember if Arthur Tress did something with them that you know, he just kind of wanted to do his own way. I think it's good for experimentation and total control in a sense. But I'm not, well, total doesn't, you know, control along certain factors, like just doing it all yourself rather than kind of doing it with the team. But I don't know if anyone's making money off their books there. You know, the way to make money off your books is to sell them yourself, in a sense, very aggressively. You know, get them distributed, and that takes a lot of work. The unit cost on a if you printed 1,000 to 2,000 books, you may, you know, no reason in a sense to go through Blurb. I would say you could contract any number of domestic and international printers to do that if you're just going to own that stock. You know, the ostensible advantage of Blurb is that you don't have, you know, you don't have them all in your garage. Like Blurb has them when people order them, they get printed and sent out. But on that, at that rate, you know, sort of like one by one, I don't think you are. I think you would have to print in bulk and have a real plan for distributing in bulk as well. And you can do that with Blurb, but I don't think you're going to do that solely through Blurb. It's going to rely on you, you know, or some other function that you deploy. Yeah, I would say not just like that. Like I don't think publishers are trolling the Blurb marketplace for projects. That would be one possible response. Here's one way that I see Blurb more and more, and I saw it when I was still in-house at Chronicle. And I use it with some of my clients in this way, is that it's a very good way to create a book maquette, to propose a book in a sense, and not have it in a sense like on the Blurb marketplace, but to use the, you know, the mechanics, the production of Blurb to get a few hardbound copies that resemble what a photographer has in mind, and use that to present the vision to a publisher. And I think that's legit. You see that all the time. You see it more and more. You know, at first it was rare, and there were questions about like, but is this a book? What is it? There were photographers, especially people that I knew in the Bay Area, who were very in the sort of hand-making tradition, who would make their own maquettes, or they would you know, hire a bindery to do it at great expense. But the people who put a lot of care into making their own maquettes were like, you know, those were really special objects. But those would be the ways that they could completely control their book presentation. That was rare then, and now I think it's going to be even more rare. I think people are going to use Blurb for presentation materials, and in that sense, it's a very good tool. I have very little experience and no expertise in the sort of like what's going on in terms of tablet publishing. I will refer you to one other thing that Andy Adams did on Spotify, which was a sort of, it was a big survey of interesting photography projects for electronic publishing in this sense. He solicited a call, you know, he made a call, he solicited these projects, and he did a roundup. And it's on, I think if you look on Spotify under either Flak Photo, F-L-A-K, or Andy Adams, you're going to find that. It's recent. I think that what you're going to see, I mean, Daylight is definitely developing tablet projects, if they haven't already. But what you're going to see is more interesting experimentation in that place. I mean, just as people who are exploring like what can books do for us right now, they're going to do that with the tablet. And what I wonder about is that, like, I've always tried to impress on people who aren't designers that, you know, they should think of the spread as the unit of their, as the basic unit of their book project, and don't think in single images, but think in the relationships that you find in the spread, which doesn't always apply to the very, very purist photographers who only want single image spreads, But people who are good with double image spreads or alternating, and finding what a sequence does, the relationship with the previous spread, the relationship with the next spread, all of those things are things that you can really dive into when you're trying to figure out the mechanics of how you're going to set up your own book. That and the tablet, a lot of what we see, even on websites too, is like the flash thing that turns a page, like an animated page turning, and we still like to think in those terms, and yet it doesn't. I don't think it always works on a screen like that. It seems unnecessary. It seems like we haven't fully found the right interface, for looking at this stuff. Maybe it is like this combination. Maybe it's like the audio slideshows that are really popular usually, or that combination of photo and video, and a more multimedia presentation is obviously one of the options now increasingly, and more photographers are videographers too. So, but I would like to know more myself. The people that I work with still want books for some crazy reason. So that's okay with me. That's what I still know. But no, I really feel like, we all have to. There's a bit of education in this regard that has to happen. And I also feel like Blurb has a new tablet thing, and there are more kind of like create your books on tablet apps. But right now, it feels like web developing in the mid-90s. It's like there's a certain technical priesthood that has the development knowledge and capability, and if we go to them, it's going to be super expensive. We can't do what they do. They can do it for us, but it's just like, God, I mean, who can afford it? So that's going to change. Not sure when it'll open up. Just like we can all do our own little blogs now. I mean, we'll be able to have these tools handy soon, I think. As an editor at a publishing house, you're kind of like putting these teams together. Sometimes you don't really have a choice either, and they're not always ideal fits. They're not always ideal matches, and then you have to someone has to accommodate, we have to figure it out, or we have to start over, and so that was rare and unfortunate, but sometimes that would save a project, whereas otherwise it would be, it could get kind of doomed. I mean, the more bad feeling you have in a project, the worse it's going to get, in other ways too, I think. And sometimes I would have to intervene in the sense of being an art director and really like sit over the shoulder of someone and say like, let's, and kind of play one devil's advocate or another and be like, let's do this, to get the result that I thought had to happen to make the book okay. It's hard because everyone's ego is in it anyway, even though it's really like just the author's name on the front of the book, but everyone gets invested. And that's part of just being, good at your job too. It's like being professional and caring means you're going to have opinions. You want to see it a certain way. But good collaborative teams are, when you find one, like hold on to that, because those are hard to come by sometimes. Knowing what you do category-wise means knowing who else is kind of even remotely doing it. And if those people are successful, then, why are they successful? When I'm working on book proposals, there's usually a section in the book proposal that is like competition research. And the competition research does a few things at once. You're citing for a potential publisher that there are other projects like this that you're aware of, and you're going to talk about them, and you're also going to distinguish your work from them. It's like, yes, it's dogs, but it's not dogs the way I do dogs. I mean, it just like, sorry to give a boneheaded example, but it's like,
It's not my range.
right, it's not my runners. So this shows the publisher that you're actually aware of the market, that you know who your competition is. And this also shows the publisher that you're also demonstrating the publisher knowledge that you probably is special to you and that they probably don't have. You're giving them some shorthand. You're also conversely demonstrating that there's a market for your kind of thing. If these other books exist, implicitly yours should too, unless of course the market is saturated, and then how do you quantify that? But also that there's some, you have an affiliation, there's some kind of like good association within this category that you can be part of. And if some of those projects are really popular, and you can say that you're part of that, and yet you're your own thing, then that's what you're really kind of aiming for. It becomes really hard with certain kinds of very artistic, very abstract, very specialized, very esoteric kinds of work. So that's when you have to start knowing like just what else is out there. Jaime, can I use your project as an example? So Yonkeros is about a very specific community that is maybe subject to eviction and gentrification. The work itself is really strong. What are the other associations that we have with it? Is sort of like, yes, there's a New York audience. Yes, there's an audience that's concerned that there's kind of like a more general urban photography audience. There's an audience that could be concerned with urbanistic and economic issues. I mean, you really kind of get into and then the vast array of ethnic groups and national groups in this community is something else. So you kind of break your subject down into these different ways and demonstrate its potential audience just by all of the subcategories within it, if that makes sense. So you really have to interrogate like what that is and show it. So, okay. Anything else? One more? Well, thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.